am here, let's see, to give you a little bit of background on Charleston. I know most of you hopefully have been here before. I know I have spoken to several people over the last couple of evenings who this is their first visit. So for many of you, I don't need to talk about Charleston and why it's important. This isn't a history lesson, but what I like to really talk about is historic preservation. And for many of you, this might be an image that is conjured in your mind as to what preservation is about, that we're hysterical fundamentalists that are just creating constraints that hamper your incredible visions as it relates to architecture, urban design, interiors even sometimes. But I'd like to say that I don't think that is necessarily the case, but there might be some people here like Gary and others in the audience who might disagree, but hopefully not. And another thing just about Charleston, I think a lot of people who come here, who visit here, sort of think of it as, this sort of static place. It's sort of frozen in time. People a lot of times call it European, and it kind of here is a view of it in 1851, and that it looks, quite similar today, and it actually does. Here's a view of the same, sort of roughly the same view that we have today. Showing that it really has, besides the growth of the urban, the kind of the canopy of trees, that it's pretty uniform in scale, and a lot of the similar, historic buildings are still there. Of course, you do start to see some more modern things happening along the edges and on the upper part of the peninsula, and we'll be talking about that. One of the things that people a lot talk about is when they talk about Charleston is harmony, right? Charleston has this incredible harmony, this rhythm of scale and building forms and typologies. Of course, the ever-famous Charleston single house, which is our sort of endemic architecture here. But another thing that we talk about, and that people don't notice as much, is the sort of variety that we have here, sort of cheek to jowl in Charleston, which I think is what makes it so incredible. And there's a lot of different reasons for that I'm not going to go into today. But it isn't as homogeneous as you might expect. Certainly not as similar in style as you might see in Savannah or Philadelphia or Boston. You have all these interesting styles sort of up against one another, and this is a great example that I like to share. But one of the things that I want to highlight is, of course, these two buildings, while extremely different and built in two totally different times, are very respectful of one another in terms of scale and fenestration, and that's a really important thing. So, historic preservation. Charleston loves to talk about how we invented historic preservation, that we do it best, and no one else in the world knows how to do it like we do. And there's some truth to that. I'm from here, and I like to think that. No, I'm teasing. But the preservation movement was born out of the 1920s in Charleston, when there was this sort of this creative resurgence, and Yankees were moving down here, artistic folks who were very interested in the sort of ambiance and character of Charleston, and it sort of created this what's now termed the Charleston Renaissance. You had DuBose, Hayward, and Porgy, and you had all these preservationists and architectural historians that were really starting to appreciate what we had here culturally. And, a lot of great art came out of that period as well. But one of the major things was the preservation movement, this sort of pride of place, came out of this Charleston Renaissance. And it was with this sort of resurgent energy came some threats, new development, the automobile, things that we didn't necessarily like to see, filling stations, things like that were kind of chafing against the sort of character and charm of Charleston. And so we had this nascent preservation movement. We had the first local preservation organization in the country that was formed in 1920. And then later, with the help of a gentleman named Albert Simmons that you're going to hear about, we created the first preservation ordinance in the country. This woman, all great preservation movements are led by women, as we know, and Susan Pringle Frost was no exception, and she was a great leader, a sort of aristocrat, blue blood in Charleston, who was very keen to save this building here, the Manago House, which is owned by the Charleston Museum, which was going to be torn down for a gas station. And she was also instrumental in the formation of the Preservation Society. So, and one of the biggest things we did, which we're very famous for and very proud of, is creating the first historic district in the country, and the first preservation ordinance. And we are, to give you some perspective, I know this is kind of tricky, but we are right here. This is Marion Square, this is Calhoun Street, King and Meeting, but this is the sort of lower part of the peninsula. Here's Broad Street. A lot of times you hear about south of Broad, and hopefully those of you who are here for the weekend will take the time to walk around down there. It's one of the best sort of history lessons that you can have in terms of design and urban form, and it's an incredible place. And so realizing that this was a place of national and maybe even now, certainly international significance, was to protect it through this ordinance. So reviewing, not allowing demolitions, and reviewing changes to historic buildings. And of course, over time, as happens, the movement grew, and the interest in broader parts of the city grew over many different iterations, different phases. And so what you have here is the current boundaries of the historic district. This is the old and historic, which of course is expanded. We have another thing called the Old City District. I'm not going to get into it. And then we now even cover a lot of these areas up on the Upper Peninsula as well. So a lot of the peninsula of Charleston is subject to the Board of Architectural Review, which conducts the design review. Both there's a staff and then there's a citizen-led board as well. And I'll talk for a second about that in a minute. Again, my organization, Historic Charleston Foundation, was founded in 1947. Again, led by a very strong, charismatic woman, Frances Edmonds, whom I was lucky enough to know as a child. And so we'll get into the meat of what we're here to talk about, which is sort of the conundrum that we're facing here in Charleston, and have been for a number of years, because we're experiencing a huge sort of growth spurt that's been happening in Charleston really since Hurricane Hugo and the rebuild after that hurricane in 1989, and it sort of hasn't stopped. Like I said, grew up here, and so I've sort of watched this happen in fits and starts since the late 80s, really early 90s, and it, like I said, it sort of hasn't slowed down, and it's sort of picked up over time. And the challenges that we're dealing with are, how do you insert a large format building into an urban fabric that doesn't really have that typology? We have a couple, this building being one. We've got a couple of others that people cite all the time, and architects when they come do projects. It's this building, it's the People's Building, it's the Mills House. There are a few larger buildings that were built in the early 20th century, but really Charleston is made up of two and three story buildings, a very fine-grained urban fabric. And so we have this development pressure, which is challenging, and we get a lot of junk like what we're seeing here on the screen. And it's really about, to me, mass and scale. Of course, it's about quality materials as well, but the scale and the mass is the biggest challenge that I believe we're facing as a city. We also have a housing crisis, so we've got to accept the fact that we need to produce more housing, and need to have a certain level of density to grow and evolve as a city. Of course, context is always something that we talk about, and here we have, a god-awful apartment building right up against a Charleston single house. It's sort of a little orphan here. This site actually looks a little different now, but this sort of jarring juxtaposition is a problem that we deal with new development. And I always never forget, after the recession, it was maybe 2010, and a very dear friend of mine came down from New York, and he looked around and he was like, are y'all aware that there's a global recession going on? And this building has stopped in New York and everywhere else, but there were cranes absolutely everywhere, and it sort of never stopped, even during the recession. And so we've got sort of this thicket of cranes around the city and continue to, and there's just huge demand. Charleston is on the sort of global stage now as a tourism destination, but also as a place to live and to work. And therein lies the challenge. One of the things I want to talk about, which is very important, is a plan that was done in the late 90s. It was called our Downtown Plan. And it proposed sort of a policy about where we're going to allocate density in the city. And again, just to orient you, here's Marion Square, so we're right here. It's very easy to find this hotel, which is great for presentations. So it's right here at the end of Marion Square. And essentially what we said was this dark orange, kind of reddish color is where density should sort of occur. Here's Calhoun, we've got Cannon and Spring Streets, and then King and Meeting, and between King and Meeting is where a policy was laid out saying, hey, that's where we should put taller buildings and really respect the fine-grained areas along in our neighborhoods with a little bit more density along some of the other commercial corridors downtown. And then there's some one-off areas like the medical district where the hospitals are, and we can talk about Union Pier if you want, but some of these port areas along the waterfront. But this is a really important philosophy that's sort of embedded into every policy and zoning and land use policies and has since the late 90s. And it's really important because it's sort of guided the way development has occurred in Charleston. So we're constantly dealing with this balance, the delicate balance, we like to call it, of development, evolution. We know we're not Williamsburg, we're not Disney. We're going to evolve as a city. We're happy that we are a successful city and people want to be here. So, the economy is strong, but we're always balancing that with the historic character and the sort of livability of the city for the residents. So then we brought in some people that you might recognize, but in the mid, sort of around 2015, my predecessor, Kitty Robinson, and I went and met with Joe Riley, and we said, we think there's a problem. And he said, what are you talking about? We're like, well, we showed him a bunch of those buildings that I've already shown you, and he was like, ooh, yeah, I haven't really thought about that. These are really bad. And we were like, yeah, they're really bad, and we need help. So who are we going to call? Of course, we're going to call Andres and his team at DPZ, including Marina, Corey, whom I'm sure you all know, and we brought them down and said, we need help. Our design review process is a little bit broken, and we need to sort of restructure how this is done. Charleston abhors any kind of standards, frankly. We just sort of, our design review process was fairly subjective, to be honest. When I moved back to Charleston, I was sort of shocked. I was like, this is like preservation Shangri-La. You can just say, no, I don't like it, and then the developer has to leave, and it was kind of awesome. But that was only because we had Joe Riley, and Joe was a very strong mayor, and people were scared to cross him. So you didn't get sued, and you just could be subjective, and everything was fine. Well, things changed over time. We had more institutional money coming to town. The stakes were raised because of the expense of real estate and institutional investors and outside money and all this. And all of a sudden, people did start to say they were going to sue, and so we needed to put some standards, more standards in place. Charleston's never had design guidelines. When we, and I know this crowd probably hates the Secretary of the Interior standards, and the three words that you hate more than anything else is of its time. But nonetheless, we had no real structure behind our design review, and it was subject to litigation and controversy. And so we asked DPC to help us sort of restructure the design review process. One thing that Gary asked me to mention, I should have already said this, is the way the BAR works is there are 5 members of the Board of Architectural Review, and there are set sort of skill sets that have to be by the ordinance represented on the board. So you have to have at least 2 architects. You have to have somebody with an engineering or construction background. You have to have someone, you have to have a lawyer and a community kind of neighborhood or community representative. So a sort of more at-large spot. But so it's very, you want to have a diversity and a range of, expertise on the board, and that's very important. But one of the things that Andres and his team suggested, which was very wise, was splitting the BAR because they're dealing with such a range of projects. So you got small, residential projects in the heart of the historic district, and then you're also dealing with these huge, large format buildings that require a different skill set to review, and even going through, the plans is very complex. And so we broke up the BAR into a small BAR and a large BAR, and 10,000 square feet was sort of the break. And so we now have a BAR large that only covers these larger buildings. And one of the other things that Andres brought to the table was this idea of at least giving developers some guidance ahead of time, so that they didn't just have to guess the right approach. And so rather than kind of putting out a 10 commandments sort of approach, we had this sort of sliding scale of generally easier to approve and more difficult to approve. Things like taller ceiling heights, shorter ceiling heights, differentiating the base. So it gave some guidance that I think was actually super helpful, and this is one of the best things that came out of this. The other thing that came out of it is that we would do away with measuring height in feet and measure height by story, which I know you all know the benefits of that, getting varied skylines and all that. But and that was also very helpful. And it resulted, I think, the next slide, and this, I know this is horrible and you can't read it, but sort of a whole new approach to our height zoning. And, one of the things that I'll say, and Gary's going to talk about this as well, is going back to sort of Charleston and sort of the urban form here is really quite low scale. It's sort of 18th, 19th century city. And I will say, in preparation for this talk, in talking to my dear friend Vince Graham, he reminded me that sort of the kings of classical architecture and thinking, both Christopher Alexander and Leon Courier, both said that really you shouldn't build buildings more than between 3 and 5 stories. And I think Christopher Alexander said 4 stories and that's it, because he questioned that anything over 4 stories actually affected the mental health of people. And it's an interesting idea, and it's one that I sort of wouldn't mind sort of bringing back into the fore. Is maybe 8, 9, 10 stories is really not appropriate, really anywhere, but certainly not in the historic district of Charleston. But that's for another day. And so I'll sort of end with this sort of crazy array. But these are all buildings that have certainly have been approved and are either under construction or in the process, or have already been built. And it shows you, and Gary's going to get into this more, kind of what we're dealing with today. And a lot of the new architecture that we're seeing is really bad. And I think there's a lot of documentation out there as to why that is, building codes and insurance and all these other reasons. Certainly bottom line driven development, we all know about that, but this is what we're dealing with. And some of these, this shows a range of approaches, and some more successful than others, and I think I'll now pass it on to Gary to kind of delve into that a little bit more. And I look forward to maybe a little hearty Q&A and dialogue towards the end. So thank you very much.
So I'm going to go briskly, but I do want to respond to Winslow's comments about, and Leon Courier and Christopher Alexander, that buildings shouldn't be over 4 stories. I think part of it is because of modernism and preservation groups. Is if you can't make something that looks good that's taller, then the best control is to argue that make it smaller. So I'm going to talk about the Board of Architectural Review process. As Winslow pointed out, DPZ worked with the city to revamp the height district and the review process. So any architect working in Charleston with their developer inherits a height limitation for their site. Who reviews an architect's design? Of course, it's the developer client. Historic Charleston and the Preservation Society, we typically meet with them to review the design. Sometimes we meet with the assistant of the mayor. Often we meet with the mayor of Charleston. Charleston has a city planner and a city architect and their groups, and there's community groups and a board of architectural review which is called the BAR. So it's quite an elaborate review process. Meeting with a client, especially a developer client, the issues that are often discussed is the number of units, what is the construction cost, what is the architectural quality, and then one of the issues in the BAR guidelines is that the BAR can give an extra floor for architectural merit. So developers are always wanting to get an extra floor. These are the reviews. Conceptual BAR is the first presentation, and these are public presentations. You're supposed to present height, scale, and mass, and as well as architectural direction. It's basically, for the architects in the room, it's sort of late SD, early DD. The BAR at each of these meetings can vote approved, go on to the next meeting. Deferred, meaning you have to come back to conceptual review and address their comments, or rejected, which is get the hell out and come back with something new. Preliminary BAR is when you have gotten approval of conceptual and you come back with further development and material selections, and you also address the comments that come up at the end of conceptual design. Final BAR is when you submit your working drawings, and those go to the city architect, who reviews and has comments on it that I believe you're required to respond to. And then at the very end, you have to build a mock-up panel. And so these are mock-up panels that we did for Courier Square. You have a public meeting, you have a meeting with some of the BAR group and the city architect to look at the proposed materials. And this is for the project that we're doing that's currently under construction. So it's quite a complicated process, and building the mock-up panels is something that many developers are not accustomed to. The historic groups of Charleston, Historic Charleston Foundation and the Preservation Society of Charleston, they don't vote at the BAR meetings, but they come and make recommendations. And the BAR members listen to them sometimes, and sometimes they don't. But they are somebody who reviews every project and have opinions on it. There are also neighborhood groups that you have to meet with, who have opinions about what is going to happen in or adjacent to their neighborhood. And then we've met with Mayor Riley and various mayors over the course of the design of our projects. The Board of Architectural Review meeting is a public meeting. It's very structured. I suppose it's like, going to court in a way. There's times when you can talk and when you can't talk. It gives a chance for people in the community to say what they think about the design. But those 5 members vote on what is going to happen next in terms of a project. There's also city architects. We are working with Tori Parrish and Lawrence Courtney, who is here, and they review the projects. They do not vote, but they make recommendations which are that the BAR listens to. And in the past, we have worked with Dennis Dowd before Tori Parrish. So what does that review process result in? The BAR doesn't have an attitude that you have to do traditional buildings or you have to do buildings of your time. They're open to different approaches. And so they're open to modern architecture, and these are examples of projects that were approved and built or in the process of being built. The one on the right-hand side is perhaps the most aggressively modern, but it is on the edge of Charleston, as I understand it. It's near the river, and it's supposed to be referencing storage containers. There are smaller scale modern buildings, but even smaller scale in comparison to the footprint size and width and height of historic Charleston can be quite tall. And modern, everyone here knows what modern architecture is. I think that what the BAR and the city architect tried to do is they think if they break down and pavilionate the project, it will somehow fit in better in Charleston. The most modern project that was proposed was for the Clemson Architecture Center by Allied Works. I believe there were 2 different sites. They moved sites at one point. It erupted in a huge controversy because the BAR approved it, but there were lawsuits associated with it, and it ultimately never happened. There's also transitional architecture. It's buildings that kind of reference traditional design. Here are 2 examples. I like both of them, but they're smaller scale. And Bello Garris, who is a local firm, and Morris Ajumami, who is the successor firm of Aldo Rossi. These are buildings that were reviewed and approved, and I believe they're under construction. But at the bigger scale, transitional architecture has the same problems in that the footprint sizes of the buildings are so much bigger than the buildings in Charleston. And when you get to a bigger scale like that, the attitude is, well, pavilionate and vary the height, but there's still just the outstanding issue of style. So before we go into traditional architecture, it's worth noting that Albert Simmons, and this is Ralph Muldrow's recent book on him, he lived from 1890 to 1980, so he died right as traditional architecture was being revived. He helped establish Charleston as a historic district. He did a number of buildings. I believe his uncle was an architect, William Aiken, so he comes from a well-heeled Charleston family. Another earlier traditional architect is Randolph Martz, who moved to Charleston. He was a gunslinger, as Vitold referred to outsiders. He moved to Charleston, I believe, in the early 1980s. He worked for a black contractor renovating and measuring historic buildings. And when he went off on his own, he was one of the first people to start doing new traditional buildings and was and at a house scale. He also did a cottage at Seaside, which I hadn't known about before this. But the traditional architecture the new traditional architecture that is happening in Charleston is typically more, or has been in the past, along the smaller scale. So on the left, you see new townhouses on Broad, and then Cat Fiddle, which Vitold spoke about in the first presentation. But what is happening in Charleston is new developers are moving in, and they have big building lots, and with the Height District, they want to do taller buildings. So traditional architecture can also be as controversial in Charleston as the modern architecture. So this is the Hotel Bennett. The concept design was by Fairfax and Sammons, but Goff d'Antonio did most of the work. And then the Jasper. Both of these projects were embroiled in lawsuits at one point. The Hotel Bennett, which is on King and Marion Square, replaced a two-story county library. There was a lawsuit between Historic Charleston and the Preservation Society that I think held up the project for roughly 10 years. So the question about new, larger traditional buildings in Charleston, the problem with Charleston, and the good thing about Charleston, it was rich at the right time and it was poor at the right time. So that in the post-war, when other cities were having buildings torn down, Charleston sort of laid idle. So it doesn't have the taller buildings from the 1920s that many American buildings, or many American cities have. But it has a few. It has the Marion Hotel that we're in. It has the Mills House, and the Mills House actually had 2 floors added to the top in exactly the same style of the building. And then the People's Bank building, which is on the right-hand side. And as Winslow points out, any smart architect presenting to the BAR calls these out as examples of buildings locally that people love. But there are also post-war taller buildings that are less loved. And the question is how do these differ from the new taller buildings being built? On the left is the Dewberry, which is a hotel that some of you are staying at. As I understand it, the developer wanted to tear it down, but the BAR said it was an important contributing historic property from the 1970s. And so it was saved, kind of changed on the outside, and then the inside updated in a sort of Mad Men kind of character. But as Charleston is struggling with development, it's interesting to compare it to other American cities. There was an article in the New York Times, America the Bland. Across the country, new developments are starting to look the same, raising fears that cities are losing their unique charm. But in the current housing crisis, does that matter? Or the Wall Street Journal, Americans' downtowns are empty. Fixing them will be expensive. So Charleston, despite the quality of the buildings, is trying to add new housing locally. So our office entered the fray, so to speak, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, and this is a map of the work that we have been working on. For each of our sites, as I said before, we inherit a height district. And our first project is Courier Square Phase 1, where we were brought on by Scott Parker, who's a local landscape architect that we have worked with, and he worked with Evening Post Industries to basically try to gussy up the facade for a local architect and developer. Our idea was quite simple. We said you don't have to revise the plan, make it look like 3 separate buildings. The building facing Meeting Street is an office building, so it should be classical and relate to the other classical buildings on Meeting Street. On the top right is the apartment building. It faces the low line, which was the industrial train line, and we said, well, why don't you make it look like a warehouse? And then the garage building had a third expression. It was used and approved before DPZ did the height district, so the zoning and the height associated with it had to go to the city council and be approved, and it became an example, I think, locally that maybe you shouldn't fear taller buildings. So here it is, finished. It's affectionately, the floor plan is called the Texas Donut, meaning that it has 5 stories of garage in the middle that's surrounded with new buildings. It's worth noting that this developer had never done a traditional building before, and we did this building with more or less the budget they would typically do for another project. They typically sell their projects, but they decided to keep this one. It was written up and covered in Charleston Fancy and in the New York Times. Vitold gave grudgingly, acceptance of it, but in the end, I think he was concerned that it was too tall and that it was being done by sort of carpetbagger architects and developers. Our second project is right next to it. It's called Lifestyle Communities, and it includes the preservation of a historic train shed and houses, and you can see here the footprint it winds in. It too has parking wrapped, but this was the first project that we got approved where we said it needs to, because of the footprint size, it needs to have more than one expression. And so we ended up with 5 expressions, begrudgingly approved, and because it was not separate buildings like Courier Square. And so here you can see these are some of the historic buildings that are being repurposed as part of the design. And these are some of the renderings that we produced to show the different characters of the buildings and the heights of the buildings, and that the smokestack area would become a pedestrian muse. And it's under construction. It's on the tour this afternoon. It's interesting because this is a precast system, so all of the brick is made somewhere in like Ohio, and it is shipped to the site and put together like a big jigsaw puzzle, which we like actually, because we're trying to use new building construction techniques to show that traditional architecture is also a viable option, and not everything has to be load-bearing masonry. We also did 3 adjacent buildings for lifestyle communities. Whereas the first parcel has 5 expressions, we said because of the footprint size of the other 3 buildings, they could simply be individual expressions. So these are the sites and beginning designs, and each of these buildings has received conceptual approval and has gone through the same review process that I just described earlier. So Courier Square Phase 2 North, Evening Post Industry owns the land in the tan and the green. We had worked with them to do a master plan. They invited us back to do a competition for Phase 2 North, which we won. And out of that design, there were 4 buildings. 3 were smaller apartment buildings with a larger building, which is called building number 1. So we went through the BAR process and the review process for the smaller buildings, and the developer came to us and said, well, you have such a great reputation, it's going to be a breeze for you. But ironically, getting the smaller buildings approved was even more difficult locally than getting the large buildings reviewed. And some of these took 2, even 3 reviews at conceptual design to get everybody to agree to what we would ultimately do. But these were reviewed and approved. And the last project that we did as part of this to get into the review process was what was called building number 1, which is the taller building that faces King Street. And it has its parking surrounded by buildings. Our proposed design facing King Street, because it's 250 foot up frontage, was that it should have 3 different expressions. And at this point, that's where I think people got impatient with the idea that somehow it was dishonest to have different expressions when it's just one building. Part of the reason we wanted to do it is that as part of our master plan, there was to be an open green space that connects this building to the clock tower of the Guild. And we wanted to have an industrial building that would be on center with it. The adjacent building, we called it transitional because people freaked out when we called it Art Deco, and then the other building we called it as classical. So we did a series of renderings, went through the review process, and it became very controversial. The other thing to note is that this developer, and Winslow can maybe answer questions about this, you can get height from the BAR, but you can also get height by rezoning the project. So this project got rezoned, I believe it went in front of City Council. It got rezoned from 7 stories to 8 stories, and then the developer came to us and said, and we want you to ask for an extra height or an extra floor for architectural merit. And I said, well, isn't that going to upset people? And he said, no, you can do it. But it didn't get approved, and because of the height, and it also became controversial about multiple expressions, and we parted ways with the developer, and Christian Sotil came on, a quite talented architect out of Savannah, and they did a lower height building, and they did a traditional building with a singular expression. And so here you can see on the top our proposed design, which is taller, with 3 expressions in comparison to his proposal, which is a single expression. And although it's traditional, it has a sort of free-form traditional style. And he is also working with the College of the Building of Arts, and their students will potentially be doing ornament. And so when Winslow asked me, he said, what does Bob Stern say? And I said, well, Bob's attitude was, well, you'll see this as a built example of a single expression, and then you'll see ours as a multiple expression, and it will allow the community to have a conversation about what is the advantages or disadvantages of both. Finally, we did the Liberty Senior Living project, which terminates Columbus Street. This is a single expression building because of its footprint size. Its parking is shared with the Courier Square Phase 1. It has a motor court that faces Columbus Street and a tower that is to terminate that view. But the problem with these sites is that the King is a commercial strip, but facing St. Philip's is residential. And so the people in the residential neighborhood are a little concerned about the heights of the buildings. So this is the view of our proposed design facing King Street. In yellow is a historic 1-story 1940s building that is being moved, which originally the developers thought that they could tear down. But when the historic groups and the BAR, they fought to have it saved. You know, our developer doesn't necessarily think of it as a historic building, but to get the building built, he's willing to spend $1 million to move it. And here you can see it incorporated into the design. As you move around the residential neighborhood, this building weaves in, and so we lower the height and we change the character so that it works with the scale of the residential neighborhoods. This is the healthcare facility that is right on a residential street completely. So finally, we did a project in the most historic part of Charleston on North Market Hotel, which is on Market Street, and it has a lower height district, and it is surrounded by smaller buildings, and we were able to get approved the idea, even though it is one building, that it would have 3 separate expressions: a hotel building, an arcade building that terminates Haynes Street, and then a residential building that faces the courtyard. So these are the types of renderings that we do to describe the project and design the project and review it locally with people so you can see the proposed architectural character of the design. So in closing, the question for Charleston, there seems to be a lot of discussion about the heights of buildings, but hardly any discussion about style or footprint size. And hopefully that will be the next sort of continuation of Charleston's conversation. I mean, Charleston is a city where lots of people come because of its historic character. So as you build many new buildings, does that somehow kill the goose that laid the golden egg? And there's also a question of height, scale, and mass. How big is a footprint size? Is it too big? And if you are going to develop a larger footprint size, should it be multiple expressions? There are firms like Torti Gallis and David Schwartz who are taking that footprint argument of multiple expressions, and they're doing it in places like Fort Worth and Washington, D.C. And, the question is that something that is acceptable in Charleston or not? So as you go into the future, what should buildings look like in Charleston? And how does the review process work in terms of, does it make for better buildings? I mean, the kind of joke in our office about working with the community groups and the architects who present to it, the joke in our office, it's like telling Bob Stern what you think, and then he tells you what we think. Thank you.
What type of community involvement do you have with the people of Charleston that are a part of the review board as far as getting buildings approved?
Yeah, I mean, Gary shared a little bit about this sort of Byzantine process of getting things approved in Charleston. My organization, as I said, Historic Charleston, we also have a sister organization, Town Preservation Society of Charleston. Pretty small town to have 2 preservation organizations, but hey, we take it very seriously. So we are very involved on the front end. Folks like Gary and developers and designers will come and meet with us very early on in the process to get feedback, to sort of just have a conversation. As Gary said, I mean, each site has its zoning, right? So you have an envelope that you kind of have to deal with, but sort of what is the approach, what's the program? And we try to, stay engaged throughout the process. We show up at every meeting, public meeting, and have position statements that we share. Usually, I would say, we try to get to a place where we're supportive of the project, maybe with some conditions and some recommendations for tweaks and improvements, but that's sort of what we hope to. And that we don't always get there, as Gary said, but it's a pretty lengthy process.
Yeah, and what the BAR is the public meeting where you present the design. We pre-review that design with Winston's group and the Preservation Society and the historic neighborhood groups. In fact, for one of our projects, we had a meeting with a group from Ansonboro, and before our presentation, Scott Parker was there, and he introduced me to the woman who was the head of the group, a quite well-paid woman, and he said, Scott said, these are the architects from New York who are going to wow you tonight. And she said, I've been hearing about that from men all my life, and it's hardly ever true.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if there were any examples of truly contemporary, not traditional, but truly contemporary buildings that are juxtaposed with traditional buildings. I was a little surprised about the Allied Works building being so sort of controversial. It looked like a well-designed, very contemporary building scale-wise, like compared to, right, you showed a juxtaposition of various style buildings, like, no. So I'm just curious if that actually has a place and possibility.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I'll tell you, it's sort of an interesting journey for my organization with the Allied Works project, because for us, we sort of thought, okay, this is the architecture school, right?
People will learn all kinds of
right, and the architecture school actually does also have a historic preservation graduate program in preservation, so and so we kind of thought, well, wouldn't this be, they're going to get a nationally renowned, contemporary architect, and maybe this is the time and the place, given the program and who the client is and all that. So we were very supportive at first, and you're correct. I mean, the scale was good. Part of the problem was the site is on the edge of Ansonboro, which Gary has had to grapple with. It's a tough neighborhood. It's very hemmed in, kind of on all sides by commercial incursions that are happening. So they are very vigilant and very engaged. And what happened with that building when it first came out, the detailing was really actually quite high, really well done. That sort of metal scrim on the front looked really interesting. It sort of was dealing with issues of climate, response to climate. And so we were kind of excited about some of those things. It had this perforated, wavy concrete wall on the south side that also was trying to be responsive to the climate. So it was sort of this interesting piazza sort of kind of element. So we were excited at first, but as it went through the process, the value engineering started to kick in and kick in and kick in. Before we knew it, it sort of started to look like a mechanical unit, honestly, I mean, it really did. And then the uproar within from my donor group and friend group got larger and larger, and so we ultimately, did fight it and did actually file a lawsuit against it.
Well, the other issue associated with that is it's worth noting that the master plan, BPC's master plan, there's nothing in there that identifies what style should a building be based on its site. And so DAR and Winslow and his groups are dealing at when a developer and an architect come and say, I want to put a traditional building or I want to put a modern building here, as opposed to having some sort of attitude that, well, maybe the modern building should not be right next to the historic district. And the other issue associated with this, and we all know this, is, the number of architects who can do, at a big scale, who can do traditional buildings, you can probably count on your two hands. And so most architects can maybe do traditional and can maybe do modern. And the thing that is probably the worst case scenario is an inept architect who is trying to do a traditional building, side by side with some of the best examples of traditional architecture. So that's an issue about building style.
Well, I'll just say one other quick thing. I'm sure Andres has lots of things to say, but I will say in Charleston, the pendulum has swung more towards classical, design, even amongst not only just the preservation organizations, but with the city. I do think for a while, as y'all are very well aware, in the architectural design community, that modernism was sort of the issue du jour that everyone wanted to celebrate, and being true and of its time and all those things. And we've all been sort of indoctrinated into that. But I'll give credit to Gary and Ramza for sort of allowing people to see that if it's done well, that it really does fit a lot better in Charleston. So you're starting to see a lot more. I mean, basically, we're going to have a Ramza designed Midtown that never used to exist. It's a lot of very large buildings once it's all built out, and Ramza's going to have a huge stamp on the big part of the city. And then we have other folks like Christian and Sotil and other, I would say, kind of more classical architects. He does the full range, but where you're starting to see a lot more appetite for those kind of buildings, which I think is great. All right, thank y'all.